Okay, so we are recording. So we went ahead and we talked a little bit about Rails. We did kind of an intro to Rails API. We built our Rails API app and configured it. So now let's actually talk about the data layer. Let's build a model and talk about the Railsy way to handle data. And kind of in the interest of time, and I apologize, but we'll have more of an in-depth lab this afternoon. But instead of putting you guys in the breakouts to chat and such, I would highly, highly encourage you to please read those links that Christine gave us because they're super helpful. And also some of this stuff, I think you guys are okay with stuff that we covered last week with relational databases. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we do want to talk about Postgres, relational databases, and how Rails handles that. So some of this may be a little bit of a review, which would be good. So the first concept, relational databases, we talked about this last week. We're using Postgres, which is a type of relational database. Just for FYI, RDBMS, sometimes you'll see that abbreviation. It just stands for Relational Database Management System. And you can think of a relational database as a fancy Excel spreadsheet with columns and rows. We're going to create an artist and a song model. And just for example, at the end of this section, if we were going to make an Excel or a Google Doc of our artist model, this is what it would look like. That's not a great screenshot, but essentially it has an ID column, a name column for the name of the artist, the number of albums, the hometown of the artist. I don't know why I put that in there. And then an image column where you guys are going to put the URL of some Google image for that artist and such. Too long, didn't read. It looks like a spreadsheet. The really important thing I want to kind of recap is this idea of primary and foreign keys. So given just a quick quiz, and I'll put this into Slack. And that. Cool, can you guys hear me now? Okay. So given that we'll have artist and song models, which table will contain the given that we'll have artist and song models and tables, obviously, which table will contain the foreign key? Will it be the artist table or the song table? Correct. So the artist and song, it's going to be a pretty simple relationship. It's going to be a one-to-many. So one artist has many songs. Now we can get really crazy and say, well, what if two artists want to cover the same song? What if, a lot of people have covered Beatles songs? So it's not like, maybe Rihanna covered a Beatles song and whoever else. But we're just gonna, slow a roll here and keep it pretty simple. So for our app, one artist, an artist has many songs. A song belongs to one artist. Therefore, with our relational structure, the song is gonna have the foreign key. Awesome. We talked about SQL last week, and you guys were getting pretty good at SQL queries. This is kind of the fun part of Rails. We'll see this in a bit. We'll see how Rails builds all of those queries for us in the Rails server. It's really fun. I promise, it's fun. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, as you guys know. Relational databases are also commonly referred to as SQL databases. So Postgres is a SQL database, a relational database as well. Quick question, can you name some other relational or SQL databases? I think we mentioned a couple last week, but you can just put them into Slack. Can you guys think of any other brand names of relational or SQL databases? Yeah, MySQL is definitely a popular one. Oracle is a huge one. So Oracle is one that you have to pay for. It's closed. MySQL is open source. Yeah, MySQL works really well with Rails, by the way. So if you're comfortable with MySQL, you can totally use that instead of Postgres. I forget the name of the gem, but you could just use a MySQL gem and be perfect. Cool. Yeah, those are some of the big ones. I guess Microsoft Access maybe. Yeah, good. Object relational mapper. So Mongo was a document-oriented database. So with the mean stack, we used a tool called Mongoose, which could be referred to as an ODM, or an object document mapper. The same device that we're going to use in Rails, an ORM, or object relational mapper, since we're dealing with relational data, it's going to be called Active Record. So Active Record is a Ruby library, and it's the same thing as Mongoose. So let me put that into Slack. So Active Record is the same thing as Mongoose for all intents and purposes. So it's gonna, all those crazy SQL queries that you guys wrote last week, we're gonna use very concise Active Record methods that will translate those methods into SQL statements to go get the data from our database and return it. And it's kind of cool because we'll actually see in the Rails console, when we grab all the artists or all the songs for a given artist, we'll be able to see Active Record at work, and it'll print out the crazy SQL statement that it builds to grab that specific data. I really enjoy that. Nerd alert. Okay. So ORM, just a couple of bullet points right there, just some high level stuff. So an ORM, Active Record in this case, is going to translate objects to rows in our database. So our Postgres database has columns and rows. So the idea is, let me grab a row from the database, or an array of rows, where a row would be one instance of an artist, and let me convert that row into an object that we can actually do something with. Send some JSON data to the front end or whatever. Some conventions, one table per model, class, or entity. You guys should be pretty solid with that. So we'll have an artists table and a songs table. Remember, in the mean stack, what we would do is we would have an artist document, and we would just dump those song documents. We would embed them into an artist document. But since this is relational data, we're going to have two tables, two separate tables. Cool. You guys are good for the rest of that. Two more things, and then we're going to start coding. Active Record. Active Record is, in my opinion, from the Good Wife, it's a little more manageable than Mongoose, in my opinion. So Active Record is the M in MVC. It's going to be kind of the translator between the methods that we write. It's going to translate whatever we want to get. It's going to write a SQL statement under the hood, grab that data, and then deliver it back to our controller in our Rails application. So Active Record would be a translator between what data the user requests and our database. It will generate the complex SQL queries for us, which is going to be really awesome. And finally, the concept of migrations and a schema. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this later in the lesson, but I just want to prime you. And again, who did the reading last night? Just a show of hands. Sorry, I'm feeling really, really mean today.
I just watched
do what?
I watched one of the videos over break.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's awesome. So again, if you have time, I don't want to belabor the point, but please check out some of that stuff, because this is kind of a tricky concept, actually. It can be a little confusing, but you guys can handle it. So migrations and schema. So Rails and Postgres are separate entities that live in different locations on your computer. And when we push to production, there'll be two separate things, right? It was the same principle with the mean stack. So we had our Node and Express application, but we also had that Mongo engine that was separate. So remember that we had to start up the Mongo engine before our app would even work. The same principle here. We have a separate Postgres engine that we installed last week with that funky little elephant, that engine needs to be up and running before our app will even work. So it's two separate things. Our schema.rb file, which that's what we created right before the break, when we ran Rails DB :migrate, it created this schema.rb file. It does it the first time. That schema.rb file represents the current state of our database. Now we could go into our Postgres environment and we could, do commands and dig and see what our table data looks like, what the schema looks like. But Rails gives us that file, so we can just, at a glance, we can see what our database looks like. So the schema is the representation of the state of our database. All of the tables, the fields, the data types, and such. Now, anytime we want to change or update something in our database, we're going to create a migration file. A migration file is what updates or changes our database schema. For example, let's say that we want to add a new model to our app. So first we're going to create an artist. Later on, we'll create a song model. So we're going to create a migration file that will create a songs table in our database. Let's say that we want to add, rename, or delete a particular field from a table. Later on, we're going to create like an on tour field for our artist. So is this artist on tour? It'll be a Boolean, true or false. Or if we want to change a data type, so maybe we have, maybe the on tour, maybe we had a Boolean data type of true, false. Maybe at some point we want to change it to, I don't know, some other thing like a 0 or a 1. That's kind of janky. Or maybe we wanted to change it to like the month of the year. That I'm just grasping the straws here. The point is, if we wanted to change the data type of a field, we would create a migration file to change the schema. Now, really important, I'll belabor this point later, we don't ever want to physically change that schema.rb file. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but just kind of embed that in your noggins. Don't ever change it manually. We want to create these migration files to do that work for us. And there's a very specific, important reason for that convention and that method. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So those are just some high-level concepts before we start coding. Some of that hopefully was a little bit of a refresher, but the idea of active record, migrations, and schemas, that's the new information that we'll be learning about today. Any questions about that? Good stuff. Alrighty, so we are going to create our first model. We're going to walk through the process to create an artist model in Rails, or a model in general for that matter. So step one, Rails has a lot. We could do this totally by hand. We could create the file, touch a file, add this code in there. But one of the benefits of using Rails is that it gives us a lot of generators that will generate the appropriate stuff for a model, for a controller, for a view. It'll kind of build that stuff out. So like I said, we're not going to do the full-on scaffolding, and we're not going to do it by hand. We're going to kind of do this middle layer because I think it's really important to do some of this manually. But creating the files and connecting them, we'll let Rails handle that. This is an example of how to create a model using the Rails generate command. So Rails G stands for generate, just a little bit of a shortcut. Rails G, and then what do you want to generate? In this case, we're going to create a model. So Rails G model, we're going to name this model artist. Just a convention, but remember that models are singular and they're capitalized. Now this would work even if artist was lowercase, because it's Rails G model and then the name of the model. But just to be proper, I'm going to capitalize artist. The arguments after the artist, what do you guys think those are? Name, hometown, IMG, albums, :integer. Well, they're arguments, but specifically, how are they going to relate to our data? What do those sound like? name, hometown. So I say arguments just because we're putting them on the command line. We're declaring an artist model, and then these are like the arguments that we pass into that command on the command line. But specifically, these are the fields for our model. I want this artist to have a name field or a name column, a hometown field or hometown column, an image column. Again, we'll just put in a URL of some Google image for these folks. And then albums, we'll have an albums column. Now, one thing I want to point your attention to, another convention of Rails, is that when we create these models, we need to specify the data type for each field. Now, by default, if we don't put the colon data type, so if you'll note, albums is going to be an integer data type. So I did albums colon integer. Albums will just be like the number of albums that that artist has released. Now, if you don't specify a colon data type, Rails will assume you want it to be a string. So just for brevity, I omitted colon string from name, hometown, and image. It's fine either way, but if I was going to do this longhand, I could have done something like this, name colon string. I just say that just if you want to save a few typing strokes. If you don't specify the data type, it'll just make it a string for you. So it's a nice little shortcut. So if you're building like 40 different fields, you know, that's going to do save you a lot of colon strings or whatever. Okay, so let me share my screen and let's run this command from our terminal. And it's going to build some cool stuff for us. So I'm going to go in here. Let's do a Rails G model. Let me make sure I'm in the right folder first. Just a sanity check. Okay, that looks good. So let's run a Rails G model. And remember that the next argument is going to be the name of our model. So we're going to create an artist, singular and uppercase. And then the fields, the arguments that come after the name of the model are going to be the fields that you want this model to have. So I want this particular model to have a hometown, a name field, an image field that's going to be a URL string. And then just, you know, as an example, I'm going to give it an albums field, and this is going to be an integer data type. Now, this is really important as well. So when you specify the data type with that colon, don't put a space in between. It needs to be albums colon integer without any spaces. Otherwise, if you put a space, Rails is going to think colon integer is like another field name or something. So no spaces when you specify the data type, or it's going to not turn out so nicely. Cool, so we do that, and then let's hit enter. And you guys should see something similar to this. Let me stretch this out a little bit. So you guys should get a message running via Spring preloader. Spring is just another kind of helper library underneath the hood. We don't need to worry about that. But this is the really important stuff. So since we're dealing with data and we're building a model, remember that just like Mongoose did in our mean stack, active record is going to be the Ruby-esque way to manage our Postgres translation stuff. So the first thing that we see is that Rails invoked active record. So it's already taking advantage of that library. Then it created two files. It created a migration file, which we're going to take a look at. And notice that this migration file is time-stamped. I'll talk about why all this is really important later on. But active record creates a timestamp, and then the name of this file is create artists, because it's going to create an artists table. So that's why that's plural. The other thing it created is it created a models file for artist singular. So that command did those two things. Let's take a look specifically. First of all, give me a thumbs up if those two files, if you get these messages or something similar, if nothing exploded. Let's put it that way. And then we'll take a look at these files in detail. Cool, got 6 thumbs ups. Seven thumbs ups, okay. So I will move forward. If anyone has any issues or any questions, please shout them out. Now the first file let's take a look at is the migration file. So migrations and schema, these are two really kind of, they can be tricky. You guys can totally handle it, but let's take a look at those first and see what Rails created for us. So your migration files live in this database folder. So you guys should now have a migrate folder. The first time that you create a migration or create a model or anything like that that requires a migration file, Rails will go ahead and build this folder for you. And then it put the one file inside it, the only file we've created so far. So go ahead and click on that migration file. Again, we could have created all this manually, but the main reason to use that generator is because Active Record timestamps the file for us. Active Record has a very particular way in how it operates and keeps track of the state of your database. So if you take a look at this timestamp, there's actually a method to the madness, right? It's 2017 0223, so February 23rd, and then we have the timestamp. So 1800 hours, so that must be like Greenwich Standard Time or something, but can I make my atom bigger? Okay. There you go. Cool. So you guys should see something like this. So here's a Ruby class. So Active Record created a class. So remember that Active Record helps to take the rows of data from the database, and with some magic, it turns it into objects and classes, that instances of an artist and such, that we can create new artists and all that kind of stuff. We can also see that this create artists migration file inherits. So I think Colin talked about this. Anytime you see this shovel, it just talks about inheritance. I think Colin talked about that with kind of object-oriented programming and inheritance. So all of these migration files are going to inherit from the Active Record library, specifically the migration portion of that library. We don't need to worry about all that. Rails builds it for us. Here's the really cool stuff. So here's a Ruby method. So remember, all Ruby methods start with def or define. So anytime that we want to alter or change our database, all of these migration files are going to consist of a change function. So if we did this manually, we would have Rails like create an empty file that looks something like this, and then we would go in and build the insides ourselves. But we'll let Rails do that. So quickly, what's going on here is we're calling a create table method. That's an Active Record method. The name of the method is a symbol called artists. That's the name of the table that we want in our database. And then we have our little block, do, and then T. And then T stands for each row or column in our table. So we want one column to have a string data type. So it's .string. And the name of that column is name. String data type hometown, string data type of image, img, string data, data type of integer, and that's going to be our albums. So remember that when we see a colon before some sort of variable name, that's considered a symbol. And Colin talked about that yesterday. And then Active Record is also really cool because it adds a timestamps. So it's going to add 2 columns of created at and updated at in our database. Now with Mongo and Mongoose, remember that we had to add like a .pre method to make it put the updated and created at fields on our documents. But Active Record does that for us, which is really sweet. We don't have to tell it to do that. So that's the migration file. And then the other file that this created was an app models artist.rb file. So this is pretty bare bones. But if you go into your app models artist.rb, not a lot going on here. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but this is the model file. Most of the files in Rails, again, they're going to be Ruby classes, essentially. So this is an artist, a class of an artist, so we can create new instances of an artist. And all model files in Rails are going to inherit from something called application record. You don't need to worry about that. But again, with inheritance, application record has all of these cool methods and properties. And now our artist is going to inherit those as well. I think the example that Colin walked through yesterday was like you would have a pet class, and then dog, cat, bird would share some of those properties from the pet class. It's the same principle here. It's just a much more robust way of object-oriented programming. Cool. Any questions about that? About the files it created, kind of what's going on here? You guys will get a lot more practice with this throughout the next 2 days. So for our next trick, let me open up my schema file. And you guys, if you want to open that up as well. So remember that the schema file, you guys can read this commented out kind of cool stuff up here. But our schema file is a representation of the state of our database. It shows all the tables in our database, all of the columns that each table has, the data types, things like that. So step one was to create this migration file. So this migration file represents a change or an update. That's why it has the method's called change. This has some information that is going to alter our database. When we run this file, we want to create a table with these columns. So if you look in the schema.rb, right now our schema.rb is pretty bare bones. So our next step is going to be to run the commands that will read this file, this migration file, and update the database accordingly. And just probably be the second of 10 times I'll say this today, but we do not want to manually touch the schema file. So we don't want to copy our migration and dump it in here. It's like, all right, we're done for the day. Why can't we do it that way? And we'll talk about, why we want to do this in the proper way a little bit later. But for the next trick, let's actually print this to our database. And the way that we're going to do that, we've already run this command once today. We're going to run Rails DB migrate. So anytime we create a new migration file and we want to change our database schema, we'll run Rails DB migrate. Essentially what this does is it runs every file in this migrate folder in sequential order by timestamp, and it reflects it within the schema, and it updates the database accordingly. Now, right now, we just have one migration file, so it's not that impressive, but we'll create some more. But go ahead and run that from the command line, and we're going to see the schema is going to change after we run this. So go ahead and run a Rails DB migrate. And again, Rails gives us some handy information. It ran the specific create artist file, a migration file. That's the one that's right here, create artist. So it's migrating it. It created the artist table because that didn't exist. We just created it. Here's how long it took to create it. And then it says that it's finished migrating that file to our database. So a really something that sometimes gets new developers kind of stuck. Just because we ran this Rails gmodel artist name hometown, we ran that command and it created the two files for us. It created a migration file and then it created the initial artist file. Just because we create those files doesn't mean it's reflected in our database yet. Because remember, our Rails app is completely separate from our database engine. So Postgres, our little elephant, they're completely separate. So we can create the files, but to actually make those files print themselves on the database, we need to remember to migrate them. So the migration file is really what did all the magic. Now, if you go back to your schema.rb, now you should see a representation of that migration file that we created earlier. So this is an instance active record schema.define, etc. And so essentially this is the stuff from the migration file, but active record and Rails did it for us. So we have the create table artist, we have the data types, and then notice that those timestamps were created for us automatically. So now we have a date time created at column and an updated at column in our database. And it's really important. This is another kind of constraint or validation, more of a constraint than a validation. But created at and updated at obviously can't be false. Those have to have some sort of information in them for a record to actually be persisted to the database. It has to have a created at and updated at. So if you try to delete or remove a updated at or created at information from a given row or a given artist, it's not going to let you do it because those must exist. Cool. So give me a thumbs up in Slack if this worked successfully for you. So we're just walking through the process of creating a new model. And next, so we have about 7 minutes till lunch. But next, we're just going to seed our database with some artists. When we come back from lunch, we'll see how to play around with that data manually in the Rails, Ruby Rails environment. I see a down thumb. That's not promising. Yeah, let me stop my screen share. Let's see if anyone's having any issues. Who gave me that down thumb? Let's see. Audrey. So Audrey, was that just for funsies or are you having an issue?
I'm actually having an issue.
Okay.
I'm trying to work through it, but yeah, I'm having an issue.
Okay. So while I help Audrey, let me paste in kind of the next little section here. And this will be the last thing we do before lunch. So just like we had a seeds file in our mean stack, Rails goes ahead and builds out a seed file that we can use or not use. So I gave you guys some artists just to seed our database with, so I have something to play around with when we get back. So that's the screenshot, and then let me paste in the data directly so you can copy it. So we're just going to create 5 artists, and then, yeah, let me help Audrey for a minute. See if you can follow that screenshot, and then I'll come back to that in just a moment, and I'll walk us through it. But if you want to get a little bit of a head start. Audrey, okay, do you want to share your screen? We'll take a look.
I just realized I was on mute. So I tried some other things, but initially I got this the same as you. And then when I tried to do the database migrate, I got Rails aborted.
Okay, let's see. Do you have your Rails server running in the other tab by any chance? Yeah, give me a Control-C to stop the server. And then let's go back to the other tab, but let me finish reading the other tab information to make sure. Okay, so so the tables didn't even finish migrating. Rails DB migrate, Rails aborted. So try Rails DB migrate one more time. Oh, wait a second. So in your application, why do you have a schema.rb folder?
I didn't make it, so I couldn't even tell it.
You should have a schema.rb file, but not a folder. So scroll back up on the command line, and let's see. We may have entered in the command a little wrong. So, Cody, were you going to say something?
Yeah, she made that folder up before, I think because it wasn't working because we didn't have the cores enabled. So I saw Mictor before
Okay.
up like way back.
So Audrey, go into your app folder. Go into the app folder, which is the first folder, and then open up your models folder and click on artist. Okay, that looks good. So do this for me. Delete that schema.rb file, or folder rather, yeah. Click on the migration file, the one that you have. Let's make sure that looks good. Okay, that was okay. So go back to the command line and run railsdb migrate again. And I think you misspelled it. So let's do a Control-C. There you go. I think we misspelled it again. Okay, so if you go back into Atom and you look at the schema file, so now it created a schema file. It'll only create the schema file the first time we migrate something. So now it'll only change this file. But yeah, that looks fine. I think you're good to go now. Cool. Okay, so I know we have 2 minutes. I'm going to quickly walk through that seed screenshot, and then we'll just pick this up after lunch. But this will kind of complete this little section, and then when we come back from lunch, we'll actually do some CRUD on our artist model, and then we'll be cooking with gas for sure. So let me share my screen, and we'll knock this out real quick. Okay, so if you're following the screenshot above, copy and paste that data into the seeds.rb file. So again, we don't have to use this file, but I think some of you used it for Unit 2. It's a great way just to get some basic seed data. This looks kind of crazy because my Atom's so large, but so it's just 3 artists: Rihanna, Taylor Swift, Billy Joel, Drake, and Beyonce. And then I ran, so you guys should notice this, so doing a dot each on my array, and then passing an artist, and for each artist, I'm saving it. We'll talk about this after lunch, but similar to Mongoose, I'm doing a new artist for each of these, and then I have to save. So just like Mongoose, we'll have new and save, and we'll also have a dot create. 1 minute, okay. So go ahead and save that file, and then if you go to the command line and run railsdb seed with 2 E's, not 3, and no news is good news. And then to test this out, we're going to go through all this after lunch, but we're going to be playing around in Rails console or Rails C. So Rails C is essentially a Ruby environment, but it has all of the Rails application loaded as well. So we can test out anything in our Rails app within this Ruby environment. Now, we'll talk about this after lunch, but really quickly, if I want to get all the artists, I can do artist.all. And this is active record going into my database. And we can see the active record SQL query right here. This is what I think is really fun. So it actually builds a SQL statement. It goes select artists from the artist table. And remember, this little splat or star means just grab everything from my artist table. And then you can see this returns an active record array of each artist. And then the other thing we could do is if you wanted to chain a dot count method onto that, we should see that we have 5 artists or 5 seed artists. So that's where we are. We're in good shape. We're going to pick up with full CRUD after lunch. And I'll stick around for a minute if anybody is having any issues. Otherwise, we'll see you guys back here at 2:30. We'll make it 2:31 since I kept you guys a minute over. My apologies. So we'll see you guys then. I guess everybody's good. Everybody just bailed, huh?